I think a lot of people were surprised recently when Apple announced that they were giving up on their autonomous vehicle and their entire car program after spending billions of dollars in more than a decade trying to develop a car that was going to be able to drive itself and potentially move Apple into a market that could generate hundreds of billions of dollars worth of revenue. But this was a business that never made a lot of sense and never really got off the ground in a big way at Apple. And if you've been following the data, specifically in California related to autonomous driving, this has been pretty clear for a really long time. So I want to go through some of what we know and then who the leaders are in this space that have been moving much more quickly and probably have a better business model than Apple. My name is Travis Hoium. Thanks for watching Asymmetric Investing. Please subscribe here on YouTube for all my content. And thanks to this video sponsor, The Motley Fool. If you go to fool.com/ASYM, they'll give you their top 10 stocks to buy right now. So one of the things that I watch is the autonomous driving permits in California. Now this is from the California DMV, and you can see that they list all of their permit holders for different types of deployment, testing with a driver, driverless testing, and then deployment. This would be commercialization of actual vehicles. Permit holders, there's a really long list of companies. Apple is one of those companies. Bosch has a permit, Mobileye, Nissan. A lot of companies that you don't necessarily think of as autonomous driving companies have permits to be testing vehicles on the road. Not a lot of companies have a driverless testing permit. This is where there's actually no driver in the car, but you can't yet have commercial operations yet. There's Apollo Autonomous Driving, AutoX, Nuro, Waymo, which is owned by Alphabet, WeRide, and Zoox, which is owned by Amazon. These are the only 6 companies right now. The one that's missing from this list is Cruise. They had a permit until the October 2023 accident. So this driverless permit was pulled along with their deployment permit. They're going to be probably getting back on the roads, probably not in California, probably in Texas later this year. But notably absent is Apple. Apple never got to the point where they were actually testing a vehicle without a driver in it. And that was ultimately the goal that they had, was a fully driverless car. Permit holders for deploying is actually only Mercedes. That I think is a surprising one there. Nuro, which is a company that's been delivering pizzas for quite some time in the Bay Area, and Waymo. So those are really the only companies that have gotten to the point where they're actually operational. Waymo actually has a pretty big operating area, and they're operating 24 hours a day. So that's probably the most advanced company in this field right now. The other thing to look at is the mileage report. And what they report every year is the number of miles driven by each one of the vehicles. That's why there's so many lines in this. But this is from the exact same site that I was just on. So you can pull the mileage that Apple has driven. That total number is 452,744 miles. So less than 500,000 miles. If we look at how many miles Waymo has driven, Waymo drove 3.7 million miles over the past year. And the other thing that you can look at is disengagements. You can see Waymo had a few disengagements, but the number of disengagements is relatively low. This is basically when a driver has to intervene in what the vehicle is doing. This isn't quite the total, but it's going to be under 100 for them. If we go back up to Apple, and again, this is the annual total disengagements, you can see that the disengagements are just completely out of whack with what Waymo was doing. In total, 3,194 disengagements. So obviously they were putting some miles on the road, but the technology and the execution of what they were doing was not really translating to being a successful autonomous vehicle, at least compared to some of the leaders like Waymo in the market. So this is one of the reasons that Apple is abandoning this project, is they just were not anywhere near as successful from a technology perspective as a lot of their competitors. Thanks to our friends at The Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/ASYM for the top 10 stocks to buy right now. The other thing that I think never really made any sense for Apple is the business model. What was Apple's business model going to be in autonomous driving? Were they going to try to sell a vehicle? Reports were that they were going to try to sell a vehicle for about around $100,000. They couldn't produce a vehicle for less than $100,000, and that's one of the reasons that their economics just never really worked out. They're a company that is used to making a premium product and then making hundreds of millions of them. So The iPhone is arguably a more high quality product than a lot of their competitors, but they make so many of them that they can leverage the design and manufacturing across hundreds of millions of products that are going to be effectively exactly the same from a physical construction standpoint. So that's where Apple's magic really comes from, is designing something once and selling it 100 million times a year. That was not something they were going to be able to do in vehicles. So they just didn't have the scale to be able to manufacture vehicles in that way. And if their technology from an autonomous driving standpoint wasn't going to give them any sort of technology advantage, then what was the point in being in the market in the first place? The other thing is, I think fundamentally, Apple is not used to being a horizontal services company. And what I mean by that is Apple has long been a vertically integrated company in a lot of different ways. They're making software and hardware and tying those things together. Now they're designing their own chips. They have the App Store. Everything lives in that Apple ecosystem. So it's a vertical business model. A horizontal business model is where you're creating a piece of software or other service and you're selling it across tons of different devices. So this is potentially the way that Waymo is going to the market. They're not designing a custom designed vehicle right now. They're building the technology on existing electric and internal combustion engine vehicles. That's the platform that they're building on. They're just building the technology behind it. And I think eventually that means that they could license that technology to other automakers or rideshare companies like Uber or Lyft, because they don't care at the end of the day whether or not you were using car A or car B or car C. Then car brand really doesn't matter to a company like Google as long as you're using their autonomous driving technology. Same thing is, I don't know if they're going to care if you own the vehicle or whether you're using it for a rideshare. So there's a lot of different optionality, and you can play with a lot of different manufacturers and business models if you're using a horizontal business model, which is much more like a software company. But that's not the way that Apple has often operated. They're also not used to selling a commodity like transportation. If you are using a ride sharing service, for the most part, it doesn't really matter what the vehicle is you're getting in. If you get in an Uber, you don't necessarily know what vehicle is going to end up picking you up, unless you're doing something like Uber Black and paying a premium for that. But that's a much smaller market than the traditional Uber market. So in all of these cases, Apple's business model, Apple's technology didn't really make sense in autonomous driving and in vehicles in general. I think it's frankly surprising that it took Apple this long to get out of this market and stop spending money on it. But I do think it allows them to now focus on things like CarPlay. And this is where Apple could create an advantage in the market, because they do have that interface with hundreds of millions of people who have iPhones, want to be able to connect that iPhone seamlessly to their vehicles and have that Apple interface. So that would be a phenomenal way for them to add value to either existing users or automakers and tie those two things together a little bit. That's a product that's still always a little bit glitchy in vehicles, and that's partly because Apple's not doing the hardware and the software design. But this is probably a better place for Apple in the auto market, and they can leave things like manufacturing and autonomous driving to other companies that are doing a much better job at it. But I think this is interesting background on why Apple spent so much money and failed so spectacularly in trying to build a vehicle in autonomous driving technology. It didn't seem like they were ever catching up to the competitors that were already out there. And as we've seen with a lot of electric vehicle companies over the last few months, demand is not keeping up with the supply that we have for EVs in the market, and autonomous driving is maybe even further away than a lot of people think. A lot of reasons that Apple's getting out of the market, but you start to think through their business model, it makes a lot of sense. And for shareholders, this is at least a few $1 billion per year that can now be redeployed into something that has maybe a better return on investment. But what do you think about Apple's abandoning the car business? Leave your comments in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to Asymmetric Investing. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you here next time.